On behalf of the Drug Information Association, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Next Generation Feasibility, Better Planning Through Simulation. This solution provider webinar is brought to you by DIA in cooperation with DIA-Cytel. Trial planners are under increasing pressure to ensure trials are completed on time and on budget. But far too many clinical studies take longer than expected to achieve their enrollment targets, often leading to discontinued trials and even outright failures. How can we better predict patient recruitment milestones with sufficient confidence? Join Pfizer's Chris Conklin and Cytel's Charles Liu as they examine the value of using simulation software to aid prediction and decision-making. Using historical data and other inputs known to affect enrollment, InfoAssist allows planners to make accurate, data-driven predictions of enrollment milestones. Competing strategies can be compared directly and potential challenges flagged early. Finally, the enrollment strategy can be clearly communicated to the rest of the clinical team. After the webinar is complete, you will receive an email containing an online survey link. DIA is committed to developing quality education programs that meet the needs of its members. Your feedback is greatly appreciated. The results of the online survey are used to plan future programs. Questions and answers will be taken after today's presentations, but please feel free to submit your questions at any time by using the question and answer box. The question and answer box is located in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. Our speakers today are Pfizer's Chris Conklin and Cytel's Charles Liu. At this time, I will turn the webinar over to Charles. Enjoy the webinar.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. So Chris Conklin will actually be giving the bulk of the presentation today, but I'm going to start off by giving some background to the problem of patient recruitment feasibility, and I'll hand over to Chris shortly for the main presentation. So the main motivation behind better planning of clinical trials is to improve success rates, especially in phase 3 trials, where it's the most costly and time-consuming part of clinical development. And some recent research has found that the most common cause of clinical trial failures is related to enrollment. And this is not surprising when something like 37% of sites miss their enrollment targets and up to 11% fail to enroll even a single patient. So on the next slide, I've listed some of the consequences of enrollment delays. Of course, in the worst case, as I've mentioned, they can lead to discontinued trials. But even when a trial manages to hit the recruitment target, any unplanned delays can, of course, lead to increased expenses for clinical operations and also loss of revenue due to delayed submissions. On the other hand, over-enrolling patients can also waste resources, so being able to forecast accurately or reliably is really important to achieve this balance. On this slide, we have a plot of the standard approach to patient recruitment feasibility, which involves a straight line projection. So we have the target sample size, which is the horizontal blue line of 1,000 patients. And we have a study start date and a desired enrollment duration. We basically draw a straight line, and the slope of that line, the red line there, is the rate of recruitment. So the number of subjects recruited per time unit, in this case it may be months, across all sites in the trial. So the key question in patient recruitment feasibility is can we recruit this number of patients in the desired duration? Now on the next slide, I point out some of the assumptions of these straight line projections. And basically, some of these assumptions are a little simplistic and can lead to inaccurate predictions. So, for example, not all sites will necessarily be ready from the same start date. So if we think about the plot before, this assumption will jitter the start point of recruitment. Some sites, of course, will fail to recruit even a single patient or fail to open, and incorporating this assumption might reduce the slope of that projection. Now, patients won't necessarily arrive to the trial in a linear manner. Early on in the trial, when sites are still opening, accrual can often be very slow and slower than linear, and so the entire pattern might take a nonlinear shape. And in addition, there will be often times during the trial where accrual will slow down or stop for some reason. So all of these various assumptions suggest that we should try to model the enrollment process in a more rigorous manner. The other limitation I want to point out of the standard projections is that there's no variability or uncertainty associated with the predictions. So there's no way to calculate a probability of success. And so this is where the use of Monte Carlo simulations can be a useful tool. And so now I'm going to hand over to Chris, who's going to describe such an approach that he's been using with his feasibility group.
Thank you, Charles. So I'll describe a little bit about what Monte Carlo simulation is here. And looking at the registration list, I realized that many of you are statisticians. So I apologize to you, but if you'll humor me for a minute, I think this might be helpful background for some of my fellow clinical operations colleagues. So Monte Carlo is a mathematical technique that gives you the probability of certain outcomes based upon the simulation of a range of input parameters. And this technique allows you to deal with uncertainty, which is rampant in clinical trials planning, and allows you to understand the impact of that uncertainty. So that, I think, is one of the main reasons why I find this to be a useful tool for enrollment planning. And this is done by the user defining a range of variables or input parameters, and then having the simulation conduct repeated random sampling from a given probability distribution. And typically you would do this thousands of times. And then the results of all those simulations are aggregated, and the output that you get is a probability distribution of all possible outcomes. So it gives you not only what may happen, but how likely that is to happen. And again, that I think is another reason that this tool is valuable in clinical trials enrollment. So some of the advantages, because we're using a range of input parameters as opposed to a single point estimate, it allows us to account for uncertainty. And I think that's important because I think it's easier for folks like myself to get a team to agree to a range of estimates as opposed to a single point estimate. I'm sure everybody's been in a situation where there's a debate or an argument over a single point estimate, and usually the person who wins that discussion is the clinician on the team, and for better or worse. But if we allow for a range of input parameters, and if those are data driven, and if everybody's input is taken into account, it becomes easy to agree to those. And again, we're accounting for some uncertainty. Another advantage is that because the outcome is expressed in probabilistic terms, you can target a desired enrollment duration based on your organization's tolerance for risk, or tolerance for risk for that particular study or program. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on in the presentation. And finally, simulation gives you a thorough understanding of which inputs are impacting the outcome the most. And that allows you to better focus your resource and plan your mitigations. So as I was mentioning before, the output is expressed in probabilistic terms. So what we have here is a cumulative probability distribution of enrollment completion. So in this example, we're looking to enroll 690 subjects, and based on the range of input parameters that we put into the tool, you can see that the trial has a low chance of enrolling by mid-June of this year, but actually has quite a high probability of enrolling by the beginning of August. And, obviously the range of inputs used for this particular simulation was not great, but it gives you a sense of what I'm talking about when I say enrollment is expressed in probabilistic terms. And the particular tool I'll be talking about today is Enforcis, the tool that Charles is the product manager for. It's not the only tool out there. There are a number of tools that you can use to do Monte Carlo simulation. You can do it in at-risk or Minitab or SPSS or whatever your preferred method is, but I like this particular tool because it's specifically designed for clinical trials enrollment. And it's intuitive for clinical operations folks like myself. You don't need a whole lot of programming expertise to run a simulation in this tool. And the input parameters that we model are factors that impact clinical trials enrollment. So who are my participating countries? How many sites are we going to have within those countries? What is the site initiation schedule likely to be? What are my screening rates likely to be, and what is the range of possible screening rates we can expect from my study? What's the screen failure ratio, and what % of my sites that I initiate are ultimately going to screen a patient? As Charles had mentioned in the opening slides, there are always sites that fail to screen a patient, and that does vary by indication and protocol. And the outputs are visualizations of probability of achieving your enrollment milestones. So this is another example of one of the visualizations that you'll get from the simulation. So here we have the number of subjects randomized over time with confidence bounds. So if you could see, the dark blue line is the median number of subjects enrolled over time, and then you have the 95% lower limit and upper limit confidence intervals. And you can see how this sort of planning takes you a lot farther than your single point estimates would. It gives you the range of all potential outcomes, and can allow you to better plan your resources for monitoring visits, anticipating queries, planning for interim analyses, things like that. So in practice, we've been doing this typically at 2 time points. So we'll often run a simulation during the early part of protocol planning. So we've got a concept of what our protocol is, probably still being worked on at this point, but enough of a sense of the protocol to allow us to conduct a historical analysis. So we'll look at our own internal data for studies similar to the one that we're planning. And we'll also look externally to see what else has been done in industry in this area. And at this stage, it's really a high-level simulation. So we'll use a wide range of input parameters to allow for a lot of possibilities, because at this stage in the process, there are many unknowns. And then we'll rerun that simulation just prior to the finalization of the protocol. So between the first simulation and the second simulation, we've gained a lot of information. We've gained a lot of data. So the protocol design elements have been firmed up. We've conducted a thorough feasibility with our countries and our sites. And we've narrowed the range of input parameters that we used in the early simulation. So essentially what we've done is we've started out with all possibilities and have gained data, have gained information, and narrowed that range down, and come to a much more refined understanding of what enrollment is likely to look like. And then another time this technique is useful is in rescue planning. So I think it's a really good application of this tool is when you're planning a protocol amendment and you're not sure exactly about the extent to which that amendment is going to impact enrollment. You can make assumptions about different parameters allow for a range around those assumptions. This amendment is going to change my screen failure rate to somewhere between 50 and 60%, but I'm not sure. That is another situation where this tool is really applicable. So the process by which we do this is, I think the most important part of the process is defining and aligning on the input parameters that you're going to use in the simulation. So you want to clearly articulate all your assumptions, and wherever possible, your assumptions should be data-driven. So I mentioned before, the first place we go to is our own historical experience, but of course that's not always available, and sometimes you have to go to external data, sometimes you have to make assumptions about how the study you're planning is going to look relative to the data that you do have on hand. But I think it's important to clearly articulate those and make sure they're well understood. And, the reason for that is once everybody's aligned on those inputs, you've got to accept the output of the simulation. So, even if it's not an answer that you want to hear, you've agreed to the inputs and you've agreed to the assumptions. So either the outcome is correct or one of your inputs is off and you have to go back to those assumptions. Once you've gone through that process and run your simulation, you can then conduct a sensitivity analysis to determine which are the most important drivers of enrollment. So what is really impacting things here? Is it my screening rate? Is it my screen failure rate? Is it the percent site failure? You can go back and look at that and determine where you really need to focus your time and energy. And again, you can express the outcome in probabilistic terms. So oftentimes there is a desired target end of enrollment date. So you can articulate just how likely it is that you'll hit that enrollment date. And at this point, you can also seek opportunities to mitigate risks. So, if there is a lot of concern around the screen failure ratio, you may monitor that very closely at the beginning of the study, and you might even put some measures in place to try to proactively keep that within acceptable limits. And a little bit more about how we're deriving some of these inputs. So when we talk about participating countries and sites, again, I mentioned that we do this very early on during early protocol planning and then refine it later on. So at the early stages, we typically use a rough country footprint. The country footprint that has been informed by a clinical development plan or a program strategy. It could also be an aggregate representative country footprint for your company. So, look at the last 2-3 years of site initiation data you have across your portfolio and create a distribution from that. And that could be a good set of inputs for site initiation for an early model. And then prior to protocol finalization, we use the actual plan. So we know which countries we're going to at that point in time. We know how many sites we're going to have in those countries. And we'll use the historical range of site initiation time for those countries once we have that. For our site initiation schedule, as I had mentioned, we have a standard for each country that we default to. So there's a standard set of inputs for the first site initiation in each country, and then the subsequent site initiations after that. And that's all based on our historical data. And, again, we use this unless there's reason to believe that our planned study is going to vary significantly from that. So if there's, a changing regulatory situation in a given country, or if we have an unusually high proportion of local IRB or academic sites, we might deviate from that. But generally speaking, we have a standard set of inputs that we'll use. Another important assumption is the number of recruiting sites. So of those that we initiate, how many will enroll a patient? And again, this input is typically a range that's informed by both our historical internal and sometimes external experience. And then screening rates, obviously, is important. So there, we use a range, and that range of inputs is generated from our site-level data from the reference studies that we looked at early on. Again, if those studies are a good match to the one we're planning. So I think when you're talking about screening, it's important to make sure that the patient population from your historical studies is very similar to the patient population for your planned study. If it isn't, you can make some assumptions about the extent to which your planned study might vary from your historical data and align on those assumptions with your team, or you can always go to external data. And then finally, for screen failure, again, we're using a range informed by our historical internal data or external data that we gather through publications, or assumptions based upon those data. And this is an area where analyzing real-world data can also be useful in determining how certain criteria are going to impact screen failure. So this is just an example of what those input parameters might look like in some cases. So this is a protocol that we were working on where we had a certain set. The protocol was being amended due to some enrollment issues and some other things. And so what we had here was a set of parameters or assumptions about enrollment prior to the implementation of the amendment and then after the implementation of the amendment. So in this case, you can see that we had a set of screening rate, screen failure ratio, and percent site actively screening prior to the amendment, and then expected some improvement after that due to the amendment, but we're unsure about the extent to which things might improve. So here, the team used the available data that they had on hand, had some discussion, and made some assumptions about what things were likely to look like after the implementation of the amendment. And the outcome, was that particular study had a 70% chance of enrolling 200 subjects by May of this year. And there's also a little plot of subjects randomized over time. And, you see a little break in the middle of that plot for that protocol amendment to be implemented. And then a brief case study on how this can be applied. So we recently used this in a rescue situation where we had a large phase 3 trial that was significantly behind schedule for enrollment. And, we've all been in situations such as this. In order to address these enrollment issues, everything in the kitchen sink was being thrown at this. So the team was adding new sites. The protocol was being amended. All sorts of recruitment strategies were being implemented. And, all these actions were intended to shorten the enrollment duration, to get it back within acceptable limits. So it was felt that through all these mitigations, we'd increase the number of participating sites, we would increase our screening rate, the amendment would decrease the screen failure ratio, and this would make the sites happy. So they would begin performing, and we would decrease the rate of non-performance. But there were questions about the extent to which each of these mitigations would impact enrollment, and whether all these mitigations would be sufficient to allow us to enroll the study on time. So what the team did was they took the actual data to date. So we input those actual data into the tool and then made assumptions about future trial enrollment from that point forward. And the team agreed on the range of possibilities that each mitigation would have. So in total, everything that we were doing to address the screening rate would result in an increase of somewhere between 0.2 and 0.7 patients per site per month. And the protocol amendment was anticipated to bring the screen failure ratio somewhere between 50% and 70%. And we also assumed a rate of site non-performance between 15 and 30%. So, these assumptions, we arrived at these assumptions after, many discussions, many debates, But again, I think the important thing is taking the time to go through these assumptions and gaining consensus or alignment with the team on these assumptions. So again, after much debate, everybody agreed that these ranges accounted for all potential outcomes. And these were best estimates, so they were guesses, but they're based on a combination of the data we had on hand, analysis of some real-world data that we had access to, and also feedback that we got from our sites. So, I think another nice thing about simulation is it does allow you to make use of hard data, but also to bring some qualitative data into the discussion as well. We did speak to investigators about, their thoughts about how the changes we were implementing were going to influence things. And the outcome was that the team was able to effectively quantify the impact that the mitigations were going to have on enrollment. So we had some assumptions about the extent to which these things were going to change the rates, and then we got to see what those resulting rate changes were going to do to enrollment. And after a subsequent analysis of those simulation results, it was revealed to us that the most important driver of enrollment was the screen failure ratio. So this particular screen failure ratio was having a larger impact on enrollment than all the other mitigations combined. So the conclusion we came to was that if the protocol amendment did not have the anticipated impact on screen failure that we were expecting to see, the probability of success was going to be very low. And as a result of that, the team was exploring other strategies to bring to bear in the event that the screen failure ratio remained too high. And of course, again, these were all assumptions that were agreed to by the team and, were certainly revisited and rerun once we had actual data from the sites screening under the amendment. So in terms of messaging, I think, again, I can't say it enough. I think the process of aligning on your input parameters is key. So it's important to gain input and consensus from all the stakeholders. And, again, if we agree to the inputs, then we have to accept the output. It's much harder to say that, projected enrollment duration is wrong if you've agreed to the assumptions that went into generating that projected enrollment duration. And I think it's important when you're doing this sort of work to emphasize that the output of the simulation is based on what the input parameters that were used. So it's important to go back and periodically revisit those assumptions to make sure that the actuals as they're coming in are within the expected limits that you used in your simulation. Once you've done the simulation, it's important for the team to reconvene and align on your targeted enrollment duration based on that output of your simulation. So you agree to your target end date, based upon a business need or perhaps business rules that you put in place. But again, because we've got a range of enrollment durations, you can talk about what makes most sense for the trial that you're planning. And we found that, generally speaking, an enrollment duration with a 70% probability of success seems to be a reasonable target. And the reason for that is, you're predictable. You want to be better than a coin flip, but you're also not being overly conservative. And of course, in some cases, it may make sense to target an enrollment duration with a lower probability of success. You may want to be really aggressive if there's a very strong business need or unmet medical need, or if it's a critical path to filing. I mean, you can think of a million examples why you may want to target something that you have lower probability of achieving. But I think the advantage to using a simulation and deciding on that is that that can be easily quantified and understood by everybody. So everybody understands that you're chasing a target that you're probably not going to achieve, that it's a very aggressive target. But if you come close, you're still in really good shape. And you can also articulate the conditions that need to be present in order to achieve your chosen duration. So, you can analyze the cases in your simulation that had you achieving the desired duration and explain, where your enrollment rates were on average and where your screen failure rate was on average, and that those need to be the targets that you have to hit in order to achieve that desired enrollment duration. And then, just some takeaways from our work here, and then we'll have time for questions. I feel that simulation results in a much more accurate projection because it enables the team to better deal with uncertainty. So again, the process of aligning on a range of input parameters allowed the team to consider a lot of potential possibilities, including some that were even previously rejected. So again, it's a lot easier to agree on a range of possibilities than a single point estimate. When you're trying to agree to a single point estimate, often it's the loudest voice in the room that wins, and if that single point estimate is wrong, then your whole plan is wrong. Another takeaway is that it allowed the team to be more comfortable in leveraging some external data instead of relying solely on internal data. So again, because we're dealing with a range, there's more of a acceptance of external data, even though there is some uncertainty associated with using external data. And finally, expressing the outcome in probabilistic terms allowed the team to propose a pragmatic approach. So, it allows the organization to understand the level of risk associated with the desired outcome, and being able to express things in these terms inspires some confidence and builds some credibility in the team and the works that the team is doing. And in some cases, it could help you potentially avoid, costly, unnecessary mitigation efforts. So you can imagine a situation where, enrollment is a little bit off plan, and people are concerned. But you could run a model and say that you're 70% likely to, hit that enrollment within a month of your desired date. And then you can have a discussion about, is it worth spending that money to bring it in by a month, or can we live with a 1 month delay? So I think, again, being able to express things in probabilistic terms is helpful in that decision-making process. So that concludes the formal part of the presentation, but like I said, we do have time for questions. So I'll break here and see if there are any questions from the attendees, or Charles, I don't know if you have some other topics that you think would be useful to explore.
Yes, thank you, Chris. This is Mike Weitz here together with Charles in Cambridge. And yes, we've reached the point now in the webinar that we're very happy to begin discussion with you, the attendees. And to begin with, Charles has one or two questions that often are posed to us, and together Charles is going to have a dialogue with Chris to begin. But we are watching for your questions, and we will select any questions that we feel are germane to include. If it's a question that requires a bit more time or consideration, then we'll invite you to follow up directly with Charles at a later time. But please, indeed, please begin sending your questions to Charles and Chris using the Q&A tool. Now, here's Charles.
All right, thanks, Mike. So, Chris, while we're waiting on some questions from attendees, perhaps we could just you could answer some of my own questions, which just out of my curiosity. Also, there's some questions that have come in before from before the webinar. So, just first off, perhaps you could describe how you used to do enrollment planning before you started using these simulation tools.
Yeah, so most of our enrollment planning was done in a tool that I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, IMS's Study Optimizer product. And while it's a very good product and can give very accurate results, it relies on single point estimates, and so I see that as a potential flaw. Again, I think I've mentioned a number of times when you're trying to agree to a single point estimate, you only need to be wrong on one of those input parameters for your whole projection to be wrong. And so, we see Monte Carlo as a way to help us become more predictable, again, because we're allowing for a range of possibilities in our early planning. We're doing this in an attempt to improve upon our predictability, so our ability to deliver our studies according to plan.
Okay, so I have a question here from the Q&A, and I'll just read it out. With respect to unknowns being found to be significant in site-to-site enrollment results, could you please give examples based on experience of what those factors might be?
So I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but when we're talking about site enrollment rates, I think wherever we can, we rely on our historical internal experience. So, typically we'll look at the studies that we're enrolling same or very similar patient population, and we'll analyze the site-level enrollment from those studies and come up with a distribution to use in the simulation based on those data. I think when we run into unknowns, it's when we are planning a study that we haven't done before. So we're going after a patient population that's unique in some way. We've got a different set of inclusion-exclusion criterion for the planned study than we did for our historical studies. And in those cases, what we'll do is, our first move will be to look to external data. So, have other sponsors done a study in a patient population similar to the one that we're planning. Something else we may do is, together with the team, decide how enrollment rates may differ for our planned study from the historical studies based on assumptions that we're going to make. So, if we have a different set of lab criteria for our planned study than we did for our historical studies, we'll go look at subject-level data and try to understand the distribution of lab values. And then, based on an analysis of that data, we'll apply a different screen failure ratio to our simulation than we saw in our historical studies. So I don't know if that addresses the question, but hopefully gives some insight into how we handle uncertainty. And I'm happy to speak more on that if necessary.
So, Chris, do you think this tool could be used even? I mean, you've had the fortune of working for some very large organizations where you have access to a lot of historical data within, that's internal to the organization. Can this still work if people from small organizations and they have to access external data? Is that do you think this tool is still helpful in that case?
I do, yeah. I mean, even in large companies, there are always situations where you lack data that you'd like to have, and I think you can be quite accurate just using the data that you can pull from trial registries, clinicaltrials.gov, for example, if you're careful about how you interpret those data.
Okay, another question we get is, how you interact with the CRO. Some are of the view that it's really their job to worry about enrollment planning, and yet, you guys do all these simulations, which requires time and effort in the house. How does that work?
Yeah, so our situation may be a little unique, but we do work with a number of CROs, and some of them have this sort of capability. Most of them don't. But I think we're typically doing this work before the CRO is even brought on board. So I see this as providing the framework from which the CRO will work. And then, as I mentioned, as the protocol becomes final, we do it again. So one of the inputs when we finalize the plan could be data that the CRO has collected during their feasibility efforts. But I think the important thing, just like you would come to an understanding of the inputs with the team and align on those input parameters and understand the output, you're also doing the same thing with the CRO. So when the CRO is brought on board, we share all of the early planning work that we've done. So they have our assumptions, they have the data behind those assumptions, and they do their own work. And if there's reason to change those assumptions as a result of the work that they've done, then we do that. But it's it's a collaboration. So I think more than the simulation, even the important part of this process is just agreeing to your input parameters and getting the best data set that you can behind those input parameters and aligning on that. And I think that's the same for your internal teams as it is for your CRO partners.
Okay, thanks. I think it's interesting, this concept. You talked a lot about alignment, both with your team members as well as external people like the CRO partners. Do you also find the tool helpful for communicating with others in the organization, such as management or other business units outside of your team?
Yeah, I do. So I think most senior managers are enamored with this idea of probability of success. So, and for good reason. I think when you express your outcome in probabilistic terms, it gives management insight that they may not have been having before. So, previously, you could say, the trial is going to end on X date, and, based on your prior experience, they probably didn't believe you. And the question was, well, how late are you going to be? But when you use a technique such as this, when you communicate a date, you can also communicate the probability of success associated with that date. And I think that it enables better decision making. I think, though you like to avoid those situations, I think when you find yourself in a rescue situation, using a tool such as this makes it a bit easier to justify expenditures necessary to put mitigations in place. So I think expressing things in probabilistic terms is very helpful for senior leaders.
So speaking of probability, I just had a quick question from the Q&A about which probability distributions were used for simulations, and perhaps you might need to go back to your slides and maybe talk about which of the inputs require different distributions.
Yeah, so I think the answer is it depends, and this is an area in which we where we did rely on stats for input. So where we have our own data, such as site initiation schedule, screening rates, screen failure ratio, we'll analyze that data and we'll conduct a goodness of fit test, and we'll use the probability distribution of our historical data. And for screening, for example, most likely that's a gamma distribution. Sometimes it's different. I think when we lack data, then we resort to using things like triangular distributions or uniform distributions. And I guess the example would be, if we're talking about screen failure ratio and we don't have really good data, and the conclusion that the team comes to is it could be 40%, it could be 50%, it could be anything in between. In that case, we would use a uniform distribution with, a range from 40 to 50%. But I guess, so the answer is depends. But for each of these parameters, we have a different set of distributions from which we can choose. And, when we know what the distribution should be based on our historical data, we use that. And when we don't know, we resort to something else after we've discussed the available data that we do have and what we expect to see.
Yeah, so Enforcers does offer many different distributions depending on the input. Some make more sense than others. So I think for screening rates, for example, we have a lot of the standard distributions like gamma and Weibull and log normal, and then for site initiation, it tends to be a uniform or triangular distribution. So there's a lot of flexibility there in the software. So Chris, did you go through a process of trying to validate Enforcers to make sure that the predictions it was generating was sensible?
Yeah, we did. So when we embarked on this, I think the way we went about validation was we modeled a set of completed studies using inputs that we would have generated from our historical analysis. We also modeled several studies that were still enrolling but not yet complete to see how accurate the simulation was in terms of projecting the number of enrolled patients on a certain date. And, the results were pretty good. It's difficult to go back and do things after the fact in some cases because there are always some unique circumstances in completed studies that you wouldn't plan for. So, for example, some of the historical studies were rescue studies, and we added sites well into the enrollment period to those studies. And, we found when we generated a distribution for site initiation based on those data, it's not something we would ever plan for. So, but, I will say that the projected enrollment duration for all those studies or the number of subjects enrolled at a given time point, compared to the actuals was close in all cases, and allowed us to have confidence in